Hello, folks. Thanks for joining us. Today we have a special guest, Hamilton Chan, joining us. Matt and I are excited to talk to him about his background and his business coaching startups and involvement with Y Combinator. And he's also a fervent investor in Tesla and some other stocks that we're curious about. We'll talk to him a lot about Tesla and some other stocks as well. But welcome, Hamilton Chan.
Hey, Emma, it's great to see you. Thank you for having me on, Matt. It's good to see you as well.
Yeah, good to see you again, Hamilton.
So Hamilton, how did we first start connecting? We started connecting like 9 months ago or something, I think, or maybe not almost a year ago, right? I mean, we just started. I think one of us reached out to each other to talk about Tesla and like my trading history, and you're teaching a class, and you had me as like a guest speaker or something, right? Is that right?
Yes, it was totally serendipitous. It was great. We connected over Tesla, and I think it was through that community that really brought us together. And I was teaching a course last year called Investing Basics through the Loyola Law School executive education program that I head. And you were gracious enough to be a guest speaker, one of our most popular. And it
Oh,
was
good.
just amazing being able to pick your brain. And that was right on the heels of you making those fabulous gains on Tesla Leap. So that was amazing to have you as a speaker in our class. And I guess
Yeah.
now I'm going to return the favor.
No, thanks. Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, well, I've stayed in touch with you since then, and you've helped me with some advice on different things, obviously, and with starting up my fund and strategies around that. So I really appreciate your help. And I get to pick your brain on a couple stocks that you kind of study closely that I haven't studied, which is fun. We'll talk more about that later.
Sounds
So
good.
what's your history like? What qualifies you to like right now? Your main job is coaching startup founders, I believe, right? And a lot of them are involved with Y Combinator and such. Why don't you tell us a little about what your kind of main spiel is? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give you basically kind of a quick 1 minute digest of my career arc. So basically, born and raised in Los Angeles, ended up going to Harvard for college, majoring in psychology. Went to work at J.P. Morgan as an iBanker, doing M&A in Hong Kong and New York. Then I went to Harvard Law School. Came back to LA, practiced a firm called Munger, Tolles and Olson. Munger is Charlie Munger, the vice chair of Berkshire Hathaway. So I was a corporate transactional attorney representing Berkshire Hathaway, the late Kobe Bryant, large corporates. I didn't enjoy the practice of law, so I switched to working at MGM as a business affairs executive. Didn't like the politics of working in corporate. So then I was like, oh my God, what do I do now? And so the only thing I could think of was to be my own boss. And at the time, my family was struggling with our family business, which was in commercial printing. And I ended up buying out my dad's 50% partner, took over the business, ran it as an entrepreneur for 16 years. Halfway through is when I started my own tech startup, and I basically ran both companies simultaneously. The tech startup was a QR code platform called
Hmm.
Paperlinks, and I basically got into Y Combinator as a solo founder back in the summer 2011 batch. And there I was running two companies simultaneously, thinking, this is so stressful. How can one handle all of this? Also, I was a dad with two young daughters, married. So that's when the idea of one day helping others along the path and maybe providing the service of being a consigliere would be interesting to me. In 2016, I sold my businesses, and that's when I thought I'm going to try to render the service that I always wish I had, someone to talk to. So I became an executive coach, and I started with the base that I knew, which is Y Combinator founders. I've now coached more than 200 YC founders. And then also a few years back, I also became a professor at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. And that's based on my legal background. I thought it would be a great way to also have larger impact. So I started and I run now their executive education program. And that's basically where I get all my information from.
Wow, that's amazing. Impressive background and experience. Yeah, I mean,
Thank you.
I think with the Y Combinators, you said you've worked with 200 Y Combinator founders. Is that right? Have any of them gone public? The ones that you've
Yeah.
worked with?
Yes. Yes, they have. I keep the names of my clients pretty close to the vest, but
Sure.
definitely I have startups all up and down the chain in terms of size. So some with 0 employees and $0 raised, all the
Yeah.
way up to ones who are Series A funded or B funded, C funded, and then to unicorn status and even public companies. Some who've gone public via SPAC and others who've actually IPO'd.
Wow. And
So,
is it like?
Hamilton, oh, sorry, go ahead, Emmett.
No, you go on, Matt. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you have such an interesting history, and one of the things that really stuck out to me is, obviously very kind of tech focused, and with all your experience in Y Combinator, But then, you just kind of throw in, managing a printing press business that was, kind of your family business. So I'm wondering, like, what was that kind of like, running such an old type of business that has been around for a while, and were you trying to kind of change direction with things, and are there any kind of lessons you learned from kind of traditional industry that translated to some of the stuff you were doing in kind of the emerging tech space?
Yeah, well, several hundred years ago, printing was a disruptive technology. So
Yeah.
I guess at one
True.
point it was bleeding edge. But yeah, there's in fact a lot of technology in print, and that always interested me. My parents kind of had a vision for me. I think being a tech worker, one day they had me when I was 5 or 6 years old take classes in LA Community College on typing. And that was when I was 5 or 6 years old. I had to sit on two
Wow.
phone books to see the typewriter. And that helped me get into computers. And I think when I was 8 years old, they had me go through training at Xerox on how to use their personal computer. This was with the graphical user interface, file folder system, and the revolutionary mouse. I'm really dating myself here. Before Mac had even come out.
With
So
the
when the
three
Mac came
axis
out, I was like,
tracker, right?
what's this old technology? So yes, and Xerox had the Park lab where they invented so much of the technologies that we use today, and this all came from a print world. So I do feel like there's always been a tremendous amount of technology in print. When I actually got my hands dirty and started running the company, I insisted on learning all of our printing presses, our new models, by myself before handing it off to anybody else. And some of these things are, like $700,000 presses or more than $1 million. So there's a lot at stake in terms of really understanding and knowing the thing. And computing technology got involved more and more with the most common, most modern digital printers. And this did, in fact, lead me to tech. So I thought, well, printing e-commerce seems to be an obvious thing. And this was back in about 2008, 2009. So I wanted to start my own website. Sites like Vistaprint, Tiny Prints, Minted.com were all just getting off to the races. Web apps were not nearly as robust as they are today. So that was where I really cut my teeth in terms of understanding how internet can enable an entire industry and take one over. And then I basically had my first heartbreak when I hired a developer who was amazing. I found him literally off of Craigslist. He worked at a large conglomerate and had worked at an agency. And he built the e-commerce site that I wanted in 6 months, soup to nuts, right in front of my eyes. It was amazing.
Wow.
But then one day he came over and said, you know what? Now I found another job in another big company. I'm going to take it. And he just left us cold. And I thought, I'm not going to let this happen to me. I used to program. I was a coder since I was a kid. I took AP computer science. I'm going to learn these modern web technologies. So I went to Barnes and Noble, dating myself again, bought 12 books that stacked high on a table like several feet. And I insisted, I just demanded of myself that I read every single page of the book, every single page of every book. I crammed through the whole thing. And then I ultimately also took a class at General Assembly called Web Development Immersive, which is a 10-week full-time 9 to 5, 5-day-a-week course on web development. And after that, I was like, okay, now I can manage this technology and I can hire people effectively. And then we grew our team and then we got into YC.
Wow. That's impressive. So would you say that out of most of the YC Combinator founders, pretty much that you work with, all of it's like really software driven, like creating software, developing software, or is it mostly around that in some way, shape, or form? Like our startup, Good Soul Investment Management, by contrast, is like, we don't build software, we're investing in stuff. It's a different type of startup. But the startups you work with, they're not like brick and mortar stores, or if they are, they're not like building their own software application A to Z like that. They're kind of like, so most of the startups you work with are like very soft tech driven with software creation or development. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say the majority are software driven businesses. I think it's a pretty much a reflection of YC's portfolio base. So mostly would be software, though definitely I have hardware folks as well that I advise. And so there are folks who are in robotics. There are people who are more on the telehealth end of the spectrum. So it's certainly software enabled, but also having other key services that are non-tech as part of their offering, or food businesses as well. So then you focus a lot on delivery logistics. So everything under the sun. But if you look at Y Combinator's portfolio of startups, some of these are doing things like trying to index a human brain. Some of them are, working on delivery of tea in a shop. So there's many different technology types out there, but they all do have the general theme, I think, of being disruptive. But yeah, I would
Now,
say software for sure.
one quick question is, you said you worked with about 200 Y Combinator startups. How many Y Combinator startups have there even been? Has there been like more than 2,000? Is it, or, I mean, that 200 seems like a large amount of all the Y Combinator startups. And
Well, more than 200 founders. So sometimes there's several founders that I coach within the same startup. I
Mhm.
understand that as of about a year ago, if I'm not mistaken, YC has funded more than 5,000 founders. So it
Wow.
is a
Wow.
huge and growing community. When I was part of YC, there were only, I think, 63 startups in my batch in the summer of 2011, but that was 10 years ago. At that
Wow.
time, I think YC had about $1 billion of total portfolio value, something like that. Could be wrong
Okay.
there. But today they have their startups are worth more than $550 billion, or more than half the way to $1 trillion. Those include things like Dropbox, Airbnb, Stripe,
Mhm.
DoorDash. These are all YC companies. Now
Nice.
the batches, I think, are closer to 400 startups in a batch and 2 a year. So that's 800 companies per
Oh,
year
gosh.
are getting churned out by this mill.
Wow. I
Wow,
didn't realize it
that's
was so big.
impressive. Yeah, so Hamilton, one of the other things you said is you were a solo founder, which I know is incredibly rare. You know, Brian Armstrong from Coinbase was talking about his kind
Yeah.
of experience and how he kind of had like a shotgun wedding with his founder and then had to call it off right away. I mean, it seems like it's pretty unusual to go in as a solo founder. So what was that process like, and how did that kind of exception work for you?
Yeah, it's definitely not the conventional path. It is there. I think there have been entire batches without a single solo founder, but there are solo founders who've succeeded. Um, yeah, I've definitely felt like a little bit of a fish out of water when I first went through the YC application and interview process. When I showed up, I
Hmm.
showed up with a Toshiba Satellite Pro. I've dated myself yet again. That was a big no-no. I should have been Mac all the way. I showed up without a hoodie and without a backpack, so I should have gone with the MacBook Air, the backpack, and a hoodie. And also, I showed up at 38 years old. So I think back then people were like, who is this old Toshiba laptop toting guy who's a
Yeah.
solo founder on top of it? But I remember in my interview, Paul Graham was in the room interviewing back in
Mm.
the day. He's one of the co-founders of YC. I think he basically is YC. And, on the issue of, do I need a co-founder? He was like, well, clearly you've already built the thing, launched it, have paying customers. So it's a non-issue that you don't have a technical co-founder. And then he just brushed right past that issue.
Hmm.
So I think, you need co-founders to the extent that it can help you get further. And one
Mhm.
of the great setups of having a co-founder is you have someone who's likely to care just as much as you and is willing to take a pay cut in exchange for equity. So
Mhm.
those can be the starters of a business. But if you have a way of bootstrapping it yourself, then you may not need a co-founder. I think also YC has a very strong bias towards a positive bias towards technical talent. And
Mhm.
so they want to know that you can actually build things and won't be the typical entrepreneur who has a great idea but has no way of sourcing talent to actually build the thing. But once you get past that, it's okay. They also say that other than running out of money, the number one reason why startups fail is because of co-founder conflicts. So I
Mhm.
do think it can be an advantage to have one decision maker at the top and to just take that entire risk factor away.
Makes sense. Now, I think for what's interesting to me is kind of like your tip. We probably have a number of our audience that watches this that maybe some of them are starting up their own firms and trying to become their own founders in different startups, whether it's crypto related or something else, software related, most likely. But then we also have a number of our audience that are kind of high net worth investors that are possibly interested in investing in startups and companies. So let's start on the first part real quick and maybe ask a couple questions for startup founders. Like, you know, it seems like having a co-founder is more common than not having a co-founder. And there's, you just
Yes.
explained the advantages and disadvantages. What other kind of main things do you think there are to know about being a founder or starting up a company? Like, what kind of tips do you find yourself
Hmm.
often giving as a coach to startup founders, or what do you see that's most important for them to know?
I mean, it spans the gamut from building a team to fundraising to building products to getting traction. But I would
Hmm.
say, kind of going in somewhat chronological order, probably the impetus has to be, what is your passion? If you
Hmm.
have a passion for an idea that you just must have in this world, I think that is a really, really strong starting point. Founders generally do much better scratching their own itch, meaning solving a problem that they themselves have rather than
Mm.
solving a problem for somebody else. So if there's something that you know must exist, something that you yourself would have been the prime user of, I think that can get the thing off to like a good start and just give it some nice initial inertia. And then the next part is, what are your resources? So I think some self-awareness and some key understanding of runway and expectations is important. So for most people, they won't be able to bootstrap a business too far. Maybe just a few months of money that they've saved on the side. Most people will need to raise capital. So in that case, then you have to ask yourself, are you okay with having investors that you're accountable to? Because for
Hmm.
some people, having investors and having a board one day is like being employed. And a lot of
Yeah.
the reason why people want to be entrepreneurs is to have no boss. So if
Yeah.
you're okay with the deal that will be struck, which is you're going to grow the company so that it's a high growth company that will one day have an exit, which means IPO or acquisition. Um, and you're okay with the demands of being accountable to this high growth, which is generally expected to be 3x revenue per year after the first year or two of revenue, then you should absolutely consider raising as well. But then the next part is, how scrappy are you? How resourceful are you? Can you get a team together and can you build the product? There's someone I'm advising who is a successful business owner, is a bit, he's middle aged and, has more than 200 employees, grosses tens of millions of dollars, but has never built technology.
Mm.
So his fear is that he won't know how to hire an engineer and how to vet them out. So it's not good enough just to have resources. You also have to have kind of a desire, I think, to get into the weeds and to really create something that is probably technology driven if it's going to be a modern tech startup. So I would say those are some of the initial things. The last thing I'll probably point out is, probably the most dangerous part of running a startup is ending up in what I call the product market fit desert. And that's when you've built something and no one cares for it. And you're selling and no one wants it. And the reason why this exists is most of the time when you're doing a tech startup, you're trying to create something that didn't exist before.
Sure.
So if you opened up a pizza restaurant, it's probably not a startup unless you're building the pizzas with robots. And
Yeah.
sure enough, there is a startup that did that. SoftBank
Yeah.
funded, I think. But if you're not doing that, then it's not a startup. So you're, by its definition, creating something that is itself a gamble.
Hmm.
And a lot of times people find themselves, I would say the majority of startups find themselves in the product market fit desert, sometimes wandering there for a year to even, I've seen startups 5 years, still trying to
Wow.
find something that some people care for. And that's why YC's motto is build something people want.
Yeah. Hmm.
So
My
how frequently in those, as you're in years of that product market fit, we've all heard the kind of success stories of, oh, I was trying to build, X, and then I realized that there was this product market fit desert. So I pivoted and, it was like magically I created, like, I think Instagram had that sort of trajectory, right? So like, do you see those pivots? I mean, it seems like you could pivot 6 times before you get it right, or like think you're pivoting into a better product market fit and maybe lose something of your core technology or core business that you were initially looking after. You mentioned the importance of trying to scratch your own itch. So if you're do you, I guess, how do you deal with that when you're in those kind of grinding years? What sort of scenes have you seen of founders that have to either sacrifice the problem that they wanted to solve or are pivoting without success? So how do you kind of coach through those tough years, and I guess how often do you see pivots succeed versus fail?
Great question. I do feel like, yes, there's the stories of Slack, for example. I think they were set out to
Oh, I
build a
think Slack
video
was what I was
game
trying to think of.
initially,
Yeah, that's right.
and
Yeah.
then they ended up creating this messaging tool. The video game was not successful, down to the bottom dollar. They're like, how about we just do this messaging tool? I
It's
think
like an internal
Yammer,
messaging thing that their team was using, right?
internal
It was,
messaging thing. It was the best part of what they created was the messaging tool. I think Yammer spun out of genie.com, which was like ancestral information competing with ancestry.com. And then they built Yammer as their social media internal tool. Then they sold that to Microsoft for $1 billion. That was a successful thing. I think OMG Pop had pivoted like 5 times or something like that. This is like those HQ trivia. I forgot what type of game this is, but and then finally the last one was the one that made all the money. And I think they had already laid off all of their employees. We're down to the last 2 founders or something, down to the bottom dollar. And the last thing was the Hail Mary pass that connected. So I think Hail Mary pass is kind of a good analogy. Like initially you're going to try your run plays, do your dink and dunks, your slants.
Yeah.
Then if that's not working, you start going for the medium ones and long range. And then finally like, you know what, let's just chuck it. How about a free
Throw that Hail Mary. Yeah.
Throw the Hail Mary. I think in a certain way, pivoting is kind of a purifying thing. It kind of distills the team down to what are the most bare minimum parts of what is good that they have created. So in that sense, I feel like the team gets better with every pivot. You start to understand how critical it is to quickly pull together what they call an MVP, a minimum viable product. You start to really understand the customer development process, which is where you don't wait too long to involve the customer in what you're building. Like when it's half baked, you say, what do you think about this? Does it seem like we're going in the right direction? So you get a lot closer to the customer. You get a lot more efficient with your time. You tend to get a lot more efficient with your capital, becoming more frugal. You start to let go of team members that aren't kind of the mustard. So in a way, it's like this distillation process. But in a funny way, in a sad way or a tricky way, it's almost like cutting off your limbs and being like, you know, I think I can get by without my left arm.
Yeah.
So you lock that off. And then you're like, ah, shoot, I think, you know, maybe my right foot also can go. If you cut off too many limbs, in the end, you can't function, you can't be successful. But what you're really doing is you're trying to figure out what is the secret sauce, what is the essence, what's the best thing we can build. And generally, as the team evolves, they get better and better at sniffing that out. But sometimes you run out of time.
Yeah. That's interesting. It reminds me of this company I invested in. It's sort of a friend of mine started called Sonderpods. I don't know if I told you about it, but sonderpods.com.
You did mention
They
that.
basically they build accessible dwelling units here in California. Which there's like a big housing crisis, and there's this big
ADUs.
push, for ADUs in California. And so they build them at a factory with a partner they've signed up that build it for, $80,000 or something like that. Then they sell it for $120,000, install it for $130,000. They make a margin on it, but and they have a good business model. They have great digital marketing with Facebook. Like that's their bread and butter is, target and generate leads, no problem. And they've worked out the supply, and everything on paper looks like it should work really well. But we discovered a bottleneck, and they've already started delivering some in the last year or two. But the bottleneck is that certain towns and certain counties, there's a lot of regulatory hurdles and red tape to kind of jump over to get the whatever approvals or the zoning or the plumbing hookup. And so it's that, sometimes you don't know what your problem is until you work through the whole business model A to Z and you discover it, and you have to pivot. And so one pivot is like, okay, why don't we just target, a couple of towns that has very little friction, and just use the Facebook to target those towns first, and then work for the unknown counties piece by piece later that are longer, lead time. So you kind of adjust your strategy, I guess, as you go to figure out the bottleneck and change things. So, yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, we're both fans of Tesla and SpaceX and what they're doing. I don't think anyone knows what's going to happen on Mars till we really put wheels on the ground, right?
Yeah.
So the rover has been there,
Exactly.
but no human has been there. You might discover there that we don't have the tools that we need to survive, and it'll be too late to send.
They might not even know how to get back yet,
so that's
until they get there. Yeah, they might have to figure out how to get back on the fly after they get there. What can we use to fuel us for leaving Mars? Yeah.
Yeah,
funny.
it reminds me of Elon's quote that he hopes to die on Mars, hopefully not upon
On
landing
impact.
or something like that. But not
That's
upon
funny.
impact. There you go. No, but I think what you described with Sonderpods is really interesting. I think sometimes what investors are trying to do all the time is they're trying to, in spite of the fact that they're engaging in risk, they're trying to de-risk as much as humanly possible. So sometimes there's a founder risk. Is this founder, did they leave? Did Pete Rawlinson leave Tesla with IP?
Yeah.
Is there a potential lawsuit on the way? Are they fully dedicated to this job? Do they have the personal qualities that will suggest that they will succeed? Then there's market risk. Is the market big enough? Does anyone care for this thing? And then there's execution risk. Is this the team that will bring it to market? And what you've described is regulatory risk. So, Uber's been through it. Airbnb has been through it. What will Sonderpods do about it? I love what you said. You called it accessible dwelling units. I think the way I've heard it before is accessory dwelling units, but I prefer
maybe that's what it
accessible.
is.
That's
Cool. I used to call it addressable dwelling units. I get confused, but I think you're right. Accessory.
There's probably no official term, but I have coached other ADU companies before. And in fact, there are some YC startups that do. There's one called Cover, in fact, in Los Angeles that focuses on ADUs. They have a beautiful product. But
I should hook up with my
do
friend
think
who started this one. See if you have any ideas for him.
Sure.
I don't know. Let's see.
Happy to talk.
Speaking of like startup founders, like what are some we already asked that, but what are the common pitfalls? Like, we sort of skated around this, but what do you think is, a pitfall often seen in startups, or let's blend it into like the investing aspect, like a red flag as well. Maybe that might be a red flag for not investing in a startup. Maybe it's also a pitfall that you see. Like, what do you see as common for that?
I'd probably focus on two things. Number one is product, and number two is, I'll just say, founder engagement. So number one, product. I think product is really, 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 really big. I think a lot of times where tech startups fail is that tech wasn't good. It sounds silly, but it's easy to duct tape together an MVP and to convince yourself and investors and even customers that what you've got is really something special. But the best tech companies are ones where there is just no question at all about the technology. So look at a company like Tesla. I think you were, not to put words in your mouth, but I've heard you talk before about, seeing was believing, like really sitting in the car, test driving it. And I remember test driving a Model S in Hawthorne before they got rolled out. And I was like, oh, this thing is pretty darn good. And I actually previously drove a BMW Active E prototype for a few years. And there were only 700 of those little electric vehicles running around. And so when I saw the Model S, I was like, damn, this is impressive. So it's really about getting into the nitty gritty. Just how deep does the tech go? You see that with Tesla, again, with the 4680 batteries and the user interface, and how deep into the UI and the user experience is Elon Musk and the rest of his team. So similarly, I think the best way to assess a startup is just how good is that product. Really kick the tires on it, really tear it apart. One of the big opportunities I probably missed in my life was when I was introduced early on, back in 2011 or so, by PG, Paul Graham, the co-founder of YC, to the Collison twins, who created Stripe. And I remember thinking, I had to meet with him for an office hours in Coupa Cafe in Palo Alto. So I walked in, PG's there talking to John Collison, I think, and he introduced me, and it's like, oh, payments? Boring. But, it is fraught with regulatory risk. It is a very complex, technical, dare say, tedious problem to solve. And so all these years later, they finally have this tremendous amount of traction, and it's been going, I think, pretty gradually or exponentially during that entire time. But that shows you how deep the problem is to solve. It's still just online payments. So they started with a great idea, and then they just built it so robustly that everyone quickly gravitated to this being the easy solution. So people always go with what works. And that's why I think Steve Jobs' phrase that it just works is so compelling. If you talk to someone like Ben Horowitz, partner at Andreessen Horowitz, VC firm, he'll say that a startup needs to replace what came before it by being 10x better. So again, this is really the emphasis on the product. So the other thing, founder engagement, some people, for whatever reason, can't stick to their startup. Running a startup is kind of like riding a horse in the rodeo. I never tried it, but I assume it's similar. A big part of it is just the endurance factor. How long can you stay on that horse? For a lot of people, it doesn't even make economic sense to stay on that horse. Never mind if you could do it, should you do it? So I have some, coachees, founders who are extremely employable and can walk in the door and walk out with an $800,000 base salary as an AI world-class AI expert or whatever.
Mhm.
So those people have to be doing the calculus all the time. Does it make
Yeah.
sense to work on this podunk idea that has no traction?
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting your focus on tech and it just raised in my mind the kind of issue with Theranos where people love the story so much that they didn't do the diligence on the tech itself. Now granted, there was a little bit of fraud going along with that, or alleged fraud, I should say. I don't want to say anything while the trial's still going on.
Tipped your hand, man.
But I think the focus on the core product being so good. I mean, that was what Emmet saw in Tesla, much earlier than I did, frankly, and you did as well, Hamilton. And at the same time, what a lot of otherwise very smart people missed about a company like Theranos, which just couldn't ever solve the tech problem. So I think that's a really good kind of reminder that like the core thing that you're working on has to work. And if you don't,
Nikola Motors, another case.
Yeah, that's another one.
Yeah, that's a bad one. Yeah.
If you can't actually go in there, if the companies are kind of restricting your ability to actually try the product and to drive it, if it's a car, just test it out, kick the wheels, that should be a huge red flag, I would think.
Yeah. Literally kick the tires.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, kick the tires. And I would say to be determined on Rivian and Lucid too. Like until you have thousands of people driving them regularly, it's hard to know how reliable that tech is. So we'll find out in time. So in terms of investing in startups
that came out.
The news that came out recently. Yeah. So
I saw a piece of news that said that if you tow this giant trailer, then the Rivian loses 40% of its battery or something like that. So all that is a random data point out there about whether or not on real world conditions the technology holds up.
Yeah, like and giving Rivian its bit of due, like it's clearly much further along than say Nikola, right? Because they I actually saw one drive when I was driving down the road the other day. It was like I saw a Rivian truck and I was like, okay, their product at least works. Whether it works well or there's build quality issues or the software is up to snuff, like that's another question. But to me as an investor, you should be kind of looking at the tiers of the product viability. I mean, is it just a rendering like Nikola was for the longest
that was
time?
Really bad,
with like a prototype that they won't let you drive, but they just tell you it works. And so there's like that level. And then there's, a company like Rivian that's actually, has production facilities and cars out on the road. And then Tesla, which anyone can go and test and drive. So I think kind of keeping those tiers of execution is really critical for not letting valuations get ahead of themselves from where the company is technically.
Yeah. Now, Hamilton, I mean, as someone who's investing in startups, how do they even if someone's interested in investing in startups, what are good ways to get involved on, I guess, what they call deal flow? What is some tips for people who are interested in investing in startups of all types? I mean, do they go to ycombinator.com or what do they do?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, they should be an accredited investor, and that definition does change over time. So it's good to look that up, make sure you're an accredited investor. I think the question I would ask myself is, do I have money that I will not miss if it should go poof in the air? You'd never want to invest, I think, on something as speculative as a startup without feeling like your life didn't depend on it. So I think definitely putting it to the side. The numbers can be pretty astronomical, though. That said, I'm getting involved in startups. I do have one coachee, for example, who told me recently that he invested in another YC startup. He himself is a YC founder, and he got, it remains to be seen exactly how much it'll be, but a minimum of a 300x return. Wow. So on a $10,000 investment, you can walk away with $3 million. That's really nice. So I think the first thing is, are you accredited? Can you afford to lose this? I think the next thing to think about is how much are you going to invest? And the most common sizes for an angel investor would be around $10,000 or $25,000. So if you have, if you're going to make a $25,000 investment, what are your odds of winning? VCs try to hit one home run out of 10 startups. The one home run typically pays for 9 losers or 9 break evens. They don't care about those 9 at all. They just need the one home. One Coinbase pays for 7,000 different mistakes, right?
Sure.
So I think, you know, if you are only going to have one at bat, it's not, the odds will not be in your favor. That will round down to 0 probably. So I think you want to make sure that you can do at least 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 over time in order to feel like you've got enough bites at the apple for one of them to finally work. So, you know, you could do 10,000, 25,000, maybe as low as $5,000 if you know the founder. Most of the times I would tell the founder, ignore the $5,000 check, because now you're just increasing investor overhead for yourself. You have yet another person to update on how the thing is going, and all for a lousy $5,000, not typically worth it. Then in terms of getting deal flow, it's really all about networking. So this is still kind of an old school business in that way. I think you need to talk to people who are in the know, people who are part of this current. People will see outsiders as to be avoided generally. So it's really about kind of finding your way in. People sometimes will do this through investing in alumni networks. So, you know, there's a Harvard Business School Angels Network, for example. I know that. I know that many universities have angel networks. There's also geographic based ones in Los Angeles. There's like Pasadena Angels or Tech Coast Angels, stuff like that. In terms of getting invited to the Y Combinator demo day, I think you need someone to get you added to the list. So there still is a little bit of a personal vetting process, but basically if you know a YC founder, ask them if they can get you invited. YC will make the determination. They literally allow hundreds of investors in on YC demo day. I believe the next one is going to be virtual again. So attending is relatively easy. You could also directly reach out to the startups. TechCrunch.com typically does a write-up of all of the YC startups that are launching on demo day. So we're talking again, 400 in the summer, 400 in the winter. You could see which one's interesting, find out who the founders are, reach out to them directly. But most founders, especially the hot ones like the YC founders, they're going to want to feel like they can place the investor and know how they fit in the ecosystem and have that kind of social proof of who they are in order to take the money. But yeah, deal flow is probably what I think most investors would say is the most important part of investing, because it's really hard to pick the winners. But if you know that your winners are going to be amongst the ones that you're picking from, then you're going to be in good company.
Yeah, the deal flow is what I've heard is hard to come by, or hardest to generate. Yeah, and it's probably hard to differentiate.
So much of this is,
I was going to say it's probably hard to differentiate, like between a good sales pitch of a founder versus a good founder with a good product sometimes, right? I mean, I feel like the sales pitch aspect, someone could be really good at that. Like I noticed that in my previous job when I went into sales and talking to people who wanted to use interactive brokers and get certain benefits, they'd have to pitch me. But, you know, some people are really good salespeople, and I've seen it with founders too, but the actual product or the, you know, the actual execution that they do is not very good, you know, and it's hard to sometimes differentiate the two.
Totally agree. I think one of the key skills of a founder, and something that can be a double-edged sword, is storytelling ability. Because you need it in order to do that pitch, in order to get the capital that enables you to run the business. And just to give you examples, you know, I know one startup that I advised that on a Tuesday had raised $50,000 in capital on a $10 million valuation using what they call the SAFE note, the simple agreement for future equity. That's the standard in investing in angels. And so by Tuesday, they had raised 50 grand. By Thursday, they had raised $2 million. And by Friday, they had raised $3.5 million on a $25 million valuation.
Wow.
And this company was pre-launch, and this was before demo day even. So a lot of the investments, by the way, for YC companies happen even before demo day.
They must have had a good story.
That shows you, you know, and interestingly, the founder himself was perhaps I would say just not that fluent in storytelling, but he was very strong technically. So sometimes your pedigree, your background is going to be the story. But a lot of people have great capabilities, but horrible storytelling ability, and they'll be penalized for it. But going back to what you guys were saying earlier about Nicola and Thurano, that it's really, you know, there's a lot of chicken and egg going on in startups, where it's like, if you build it, they will come. Then you build it, are they coming? Okay, they kind of came. So then we got to go build something else and then see if we can build upon that. And that's how you
Yeah.
end up with sometimes people overpromising and under delivering. There are key mantras in the space, like, move fast and break things, I think was a Facebook motto for some time. I may have misattributed that, but that is a common phrase. Another one is fake it till you make it. And so that's where some founders can fall into trouble, where they're faking it and they never get to the making it part.
Yeah.
So
Make it
you
too
really
hard.
have
Yeah.
to be a little bit of a truth teller when you are investing, and technical diligence is key. I think you can look at other social proof markers to see whether someone seems legit or not. If they have the background that would suggest that they are legit, then I think that puts everyone at ease.
Just like I'm looking on LinkedIn or something, kind of their background, or a Google search kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, even when I've heard you tell your story, I'm like, okay, I know Interactive Brokers, they're super legit. You were one of the top salespeople there. You worked at UBS. These are things that, in all likelihood, you're not some crazy guy out there who,
I am a little
is not
crazy. I don't
reliable,
know.
is not sophisticated.
Good crazy though.
But this is on the investor. The investor has to be a good judge of character too.